Good afternoon and welcome to our live Liberty Alert. And my name is Gregory Seltz, Executive Director of the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty. And each week we gather and we're trying to address the issues of the day from a two-kingdom biblical worldview, a biblical engagement strategy. And in America, there's some real benefits to that, because in America we have constitutional protections to do that. But we also affirm that there are constitutional responsibilities to that. And so each week we try to gather and talk about the issues that the church and God's people should be engaging. We don't tell you always how to engage, but we give you critical ways to think these things through so that you can be useful in God's hands. Today the theme is who decides who is free to serve? I mean, who makes that decision? And we're starting to see that people are giving away major decisions of their life to third parties as if those third parties are going to do what is ultimately best for them. Well, that's just not the way we do things. I mean, that's not, we take responsibility for our families, we take responsibility for our lives, we take responsibility for our communities. So today we're going to talk about what's going on out there. It's crazy out there. There are some states that are doing a great job. They have a balanced, thoughtful way of opening up. I submit to you that Florida is doing an incredible job. They had a lot of folks who they were the group that could be most affected by the pandemic, and yet they're doing a phenomenal job of protecting those who are at risk and opening the state up, and also balancing the First Amendment rights and responsibilities of their citizens. Others are very dictatorial and fear-mongering. I mean, it's crazy. We have some governors who are telling you how to actually use tennis balls on tennis courts, as if they're getting into that kind of minutia of our lives. That's not their responsibility. As I said, constitutional protections limit especially those who are in authority so that we can actually exercise our free lives in service to others, faithful to God as well. The bigger question, again, like I said, is who gets to decide. We'll talk about some fundamental issues, some fundamental things, if you will, to help you make those, to be more critically in how you think about how you're going to move forward. And the bigger thing today is to talk about family. The Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty focuses on four major issues in D.C. because they really apply to the culture as a whole. And we think the church needs to speak to these issues as a whole. The first one is obviously religious liberty, because that is a fundamental principle in our culture, and it really protects the liberty of all people in our culture as well. And so we defend that. The second one is the sanctity of life. Well, the sanctity of life is fundamental to who you are as a human being. If we don't fight for that, I mean, what's the point of the rest of this stuff? So those are the two big ones. To us, that's a religious liberty issue. But we need to also take responsibility as we talk about, because we believe, and I think this is absolutely true, that the family is the solution to a lot of the problems we're facing. And so the church has an opportunity to undergird healthy families. Father, mother, child is the civil trinity, if you will, for a humane culture. And we need to be helping people through that. Now, other people disagree with our view of family. That's fine, I guess, as long as they allow us to actually move forward with this institutional view of family, and we can defend it in many different ways. Today I want to talk about why that is also under assault in this pandemic and what we can do about that. And then the last one we talk about is educational freedom. Who gets who educates our children, and that's going to be a battle line in the future. Before we get started, though, today, a couple of things. I'm going to be posting this online. It's called the COVID-19 Reopening Resource from Alliance Defending Freedom. This is more of a legal document, the kind of things you should be thinking through, talking again about your constitutional rights, your responsibilities and opportunities. And it's a really great resource. It may take an extra day or so for me to get that on our website, lcrlfreedom.org, because my good friend and guy that works with me here at the LCRL, Rich Coors, is I think he's home now, but he had exploratory surgery on his heart yesterday. They put a stent in. He's doing great. But Rich takes care of all that. He's the genius who then works with our web folks, and I'm going to have to do some of this today. So, it may take an extra day to get it done. But that's a great resource. And Alliance Defending Freedom is someone we work in partnership with, and as we get great resources from them, we'll bring those to you, and we may even comment on those too. This one's just great as it is, so just take it and put it to work. Also going to be talking about something today. If you've been watching this, Illinois governor, an article that I was reading says that churches may have to stay closed for more than a year. Who does he think he is? Well, we have three district presidents. In our church, we don't have a hierarchical church. We have kind of a bottom-up church, and we have our synodical president, and then he's represented by district presidents throughout the country. We have three in Illinois, by the way, the Southern Illinois, Central Illinois, and Northern Illinois district. And the presidents of those districts sent a letter to the governor saying that this was not right. This was overreach because he's basically not letting the churches open up until he's basically not opening it up until the churches meet the fifth level, if you will, the fifth wave. So that prompted also a letter from our synodical president, our LCMS president, Matt Harrison, to the Attorney General, William Barr, because he said this is basically Caesar's claiming too much. This is overreach. And so we're going to talk about those in a minute, but I'll have those letters posted up on our website so you can read them. It gives you a sense of how we approach these kinds of issues. The LCMS puts a lot of power in individual congregations, okay? And so we don't have a kind of a dictatorial top-down. We all agree on certain confessional issues, and then we try to apply those confessional issues uniquely to our neighborhoods. And so we don't have a top-down view of how we're supposed to deal with COVID-19. We have some general principles, and then we tell our people to work from those principles and formulate their actions going forward. When it runs into a dictatorial governor, then we jump in as a church, and that's what's happening there. And also some good news. This is good news because sometimes we only focus on the bad news. A few weeks ago, I'm not going to mention Nathan's last name, but he was a lawyer, LCMS lawyer out in Idaho, and he was dealing with a lot of these government overreach things, and he contacted our office, and we talked through some things. We tried to see how we could be of help to him, and I just contacted him last week and said, how's it going? Because they were trying to bring litigation for the sake of the church, because these governors are producing documents that are very vague, and those vague documents can be abused on the ground. And they were being abused in the individual communities and against individual churches and pastors. And I asked him how it was going, and he said, good news. I'll read this. He said, after our call with the Attorney General from the state, our stipulations for religious liberty, the governor signed a new order entering stage 2, and it dealt with and corrected all our contentions. And so, again, that just shows the proper way of dealing with these things. We're trying to be faithful. We're trying to deal with what we think this pandemic is, but we're also trying to say the bigger issue is that our religious faith, our faith in God, is bigger than these issues. And if someone starts to say, no, it's not, we have to say, I'm sorry, but it is. And that was done very well. So congratulations to Nathan and that. So there's good news there. The guidelines that they originally got were very punitive because they were vague. And one of the things I'm learning as I'm in D.C. more is, D.C. is basically lawyers and lobbyists. And they have a way of speaking that gives them, they can say something that gives them a lot of room to apply it. And that's one of the good things about this last administration. They've come in and they've said, you know what, we're going back to straightforward language on some of these guidelines, because these guidelines can be abused in so many ways with these agency guidelines. So the EEOC guidelines, well, when you go from 3 or 4 protected categories to 10 or 11 protected categories, and then they're written kind of vaguely, they can be used very punitively on the street of our lives. And so again, clarity is something that we need to fight for. And Romans 13, submit to the authorities, is very biblical, but it's applied differently, as we'll learn in a minute, in a constitutional republic. Because in some sense, submit to the authorities, we are called to be the authorities in our own lives constitutionally. So it's not just defend that right, we now need to figure out how to exercise that right. So it was interesting the other day, I saw that China was mocking our view of federalism, and it was mocking our view of individual rights and individual conscience. And they were mocking it because they said, look how messy of a way it is to apply to the pandemic of COVID-19. Now, it's funny to me that China, which kind of unleashed this on the world, is now telling us exactly how to deal with it. But they were mocking it because it's not efficient. They said it's not an efficient way to deal with the pandemic. See, it's much better just lock everybody down, lock them in their homes, and when the people are sick die off, then you open things back up. Well, do you want to live in a society like that? And so it is interesting. We're going to struggle with liberty and security. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But I just thought that was amazing. Thank God it doesn't work that way here. And so we'll talk about that today. So Liberty Alert Live, and we're going to talk about who decides who is free to serve. Thanks again for tuning in. Thanks again for sharing these live Liberty Alerts with people. I can't do it without you. And one thing to let you know is all these things are recorded and they're all online. So if you miss 1 week, I'm starting to see people going back to work. They can't always make the afternoon taping or the afternoon live version of this. So that's fine. You can go back and you can review these things later too. But join in if you're able to. So I'm going to start with a letter from one of our supporters. And Ed writes this. And now this was a letter he wrote to his pastor. And he said, I would like to ask, how long are we going to go with this no worship services and just have virtual ones? And so he talks about that, and he said, listen, I understand all levels of government are obedient to the United States Constitution, upon which our laws are to be subject, with all leaders subject to that, as well as the people. I can't find anywhere in the Constitution where it says where it says the Constitution can be put aside and not followed in an emergency. And he says that the government, it doesn't have the claim to the authority to disregard our First Amendment rights of freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, and freedom of speech. Government is not our health or spiritual. To start with today is that when we start to talk about these issues, who gets to decide? And that's kind of the impetus of Ed's letter. Now, Ed is challenging, the church where he's at, and I would just say this, first of all, folks, pray for your pastors. Pray for your church council leaders. Pray for your elders, especially because the church is under pressure right now. We're getting pressured from both sides. We're being kind of put in a corner by certain elements in our society, and they're using the pandemic to do that. But if we move out in a callous way, it gives the impression that we don't care about our neighborhood. We do. So we're struggling to balance that. So pray for your pastors and be a part of that solution. Get together with your pastors, your church council, your elders, and then your circuits, and talk about how we've talked about this. How can we move forward? What are the ways we will decide to move forward? And that's what we want to talk about today. Use your sanctified common sense to critically receive the information that you need to make the decisions going forward, but honor those fundamental principles in your life that allow you to move forward through any one of these kinds of issues with a faith, with a courage, and with a joy. You can be joyful in the middle of this craziness. Did you know that? The joy of the Lord, that is going to be our strength going forward. Now, a couple of things, again, before we address some of the specifics. We've got a couple of letters and a couple of articles we're going to talk about. But we've talked about this too. Trust not in princes. It's amazing to me that we're putting our trust in third parties on fundamental issues of life. The goal is to put our trust in God and then actually be faithful in serving one another, faithful to Him, loving to each other. In our church, we have a very basic phrase in our liturgy: faith toward God, He's the one we put our trust in, service to our neighbor, love and service to our neighbor. So again, that's kind of the focus of the Christian life in a nutshell, but it is really a tremendous way of organizing our life even as citizens. The Founding Fathers understood that free, religious, motivated, self-disciplined citizens, that was the key for everybody's liberty. That's the point. And so if you suddenly put the church in the basement and you take away people's religious liberties, you lose First Amendment liberties and protections for all. Faith, not fear. C.S. Lewis said human beings have always lived on the precipice. Maybe that's the issue. Maybe the issue is people are confronted with their mortality and the fragileness or fragility of life on this sinful, broken planet. And they're starting to say, well, who can take care of that? Maybe that's the issue that's finally hitting everybody all at once. Well, there are two answers to that: technology, big government, or faith and freedom. And they don't mix. And so listen to how people talk about the solutions. If they start talking about give all of your responsibility over to some person over here and they'll make it for you, I got bad news for you. That's going to take away your liberties and take away your ability to live free lives for the sake of others. Honor Caesar, be faithful to God. I think, again, the thing to keep in mind there is speak the truth. Be grounded in a biblical understanding of all these things. Speak the truth in love toward neighbor. If you do that, you're going to be able to honor Caesar properly, and then you're going to push back on Caesar when the time is right, and you're especially going to be faithful to God and faithful to neighbor. And then finally, the uniqueness of the American experiment. I can't say this enough because people don't know it today. There's inherent dignity in every human being. That's a fundamental teaching in American constitutional polity. The only thing that undergirds that is the notion that all are created in the image of God. If you get rid of that notion, there is no inherent dignity in humanity, and then we're forced into groups, and you as a person ceases to exist. Religious liberty, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, these are fundamental to those who have rights of conscience. We do need to push back on this notion that you're free to do whatever you want. The Founding Fathers never thought that. We don't either. You're free to do what's right. You're free to serve. You're free to be faithful. And then religious responsibility, self-governance, and a willingness to put into practice the truths that you know to be true, both eternally true and the temporally true things. You need to be able to figure out how to differentiate those things. That's the kind of learning that we need to be about. All right, it's getting crazy out there. Some states are balanced, thoughtful, others are dictatorial, fear-mongering. What's going on? So as we've talked about solutions going forward, gather the information, put your plan together. First Amendment protects you, but First Amendment also compels you to be responsible and to be in action. So you can't demand First Amendment protections and then sit around and do nothing. But when you start to do things and you find that there's this hammer a tyrannical hammer that's saying you can't do that when you have the right to do it, that's the kind of pushback we need to be about. Now, there's a couple of articles this week that I thought were very good that were out there. One of them was the Catholic bishops responded, and they had an article for the sake of the church and for the sake of the world. And I thought that was an incredible article because it was focusing again on the abuses that are happening in the name of the pandemic. And it basically said these abuses are wrong. They're fundamentally wrong. And I think we can make an argument for the fact that we were created to be free as human beings. We know that God gave us eternal freedom in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. But even in our daily lives, this side of heaven, there's a sense that we're free to serve and we're free to worship and we're free to care for each other. That's part of what it means to be human. And they put that letter together and we signed on with that and said, we believe these same fundamental issues in our culture, and we stand with all these churches. There were churches, there were individual people, there were lawyers, there were doctors, there were legislators. Everybody was signing on who believed in those principles. So again, that was a healthy thing, where again the church as a whole was pushing back and saying we have these freedoms. We also saw that happening, as I said, with our LCMS. The Illinois governor is basically doubling down on the lockdown, and he's putting the church in that non-essential category, and we're saying you can't do that. I mean, it's constitutionally wrong, especially now that we know what we know about this pandemic, how contagious it is, how virulent it is. We know that, and it's not like it was when we were all scared to death about 2 months ago. It's still a scary thing, but life is a scary thing. And again, there's no way that the government can grant you absolute protection from the issues of life. And so again, who has the freedom to move forward? I love, again, what the district presidents wrote to the governor, and that's where it needed to start. And he talked about under phase 3, people up to 10 people can gather. In phase 4, schools would be allowed to open. And then it talked about how this affects 500 of our schools in Illinois. And then finally it said it was only phase 5 where worship gatherings were allowed to be opened. And that could be a year. That could be forever. And he was talking about when we finally have a cure for this, or when we have some kind of treatment that absolutely mitigates it. Well, that's code word for it's never going to happen, and you're going to have to redo how you do things. Well, he doesn't have the right to make those kinds of decisions. That's not his role, especially with what we know. So they wrote this letter back, and it basically said, we care about our health and welfare of our neighbors. We're eager to follow CDC guidelines for hygiene and social distancing. We simply ask that our churches would be free to practice our religion and assemble with the least restrictive means necessary. It's a great letter, and I'm going to post that. You can see how that's done well. Well, as I said before, but I don't think their governor is going to take heed to that very much. And so our synodical president, Matt Harrison, wrote to our Attorney General, William Barr, and he talked about Caesar claims too much. And he basically said, to move the church to phase 5, it basically is not only unreasonable, but it's unconstitutional. And I love how he closed his letter. He said, we respect government as a necessary gift from God. We pray for all our national and local leaders, including the governor of Illinois. But we believe, just as St. Paul, when he appealed to Caesar as a right of his Roman citizenship when it was violated, it's God-pleasing to appeal to the Department of Justice to scrutinize the plans of the governor of Illinois in this case. Render under Caesar the things that are Caesar's, but we also render under God with those things that are God. And in this case, Caesar's claiming too much. I thought it was a very balanced letter, and he talked about how our church is not a hierarchical church and how we try to honor things locally and make solutions that are good for the community locally. It's a good letter. We'll post that. But again, you begin to see these religious liberty concerns that are out there. There's an overreach where people are saying, we will determine these questions for you. So the roots of this overreach, I think, is that people are buying into the fear of this. And again, I don't know if it's because they've never thought about the fact that of their own mortality. I don't know if it's just so sudden, like, now what do we do? But my point is, don't ever make these major decisions about your life based on fear. That's the worst way to do it. In fact, the best thing to do is when you're most afraid, then go back to those fundamental principles that you know to be true and start to figure out, use that to help you make decisions. And liberty are in an inverse relationship to each other. The more liberty you have, the less security you have. The more security you have, the less liberty you have. And so as people give their rights away for the sake of security, they assume that they can then go do the things they've always wanted to do. You can't. And that's why our founding fathers said that the worst thing is government power coalesced in one area, because they will begin to tell you what to do concerning everything. I fear that our younger generation is being taught that you can have absolute liberty and absolute security. You can have both, and they're in an inverse relationship. Again, in some of my readings, it said, where kings rule, subjects obey out of fear. Where people rule, Citizens must be educated with morals and virtues and then act freely in service to others. So that's the key. And right now, I think there's two things going on in our culture. We're dealing with our mortality, and we're saying technology will solve all that. It will not. Science will not solve all that. It's not going to answer all your questions. Faith, religion, a moral perspective on life is how we begin to deal even with that information properly. So the bigger question is, who gets to decide? I mean, who gets to decide these fundamental issues in our lives? And I would just tell you, you can't pass these off. Maybe you want to, but you can't pass these issues off. And I'll give you a story. The last 2-3 weeks, I've had a car that I really love. This car, I call it my vacation. It's a convertible. I get to put the top down and just drive home slow from work, and that's always been my vacation, if you will, because I don't take that many vacations. Well, for some reason, I forgot to get the license plates in a timely fashion. I wasn't late, but when I finally figured out I got to go do it, the DMV was closed down for Corona. Here's what happened. My car then had problems. I had to take it in. My mechanic, the one that works on my car, generally said, "Greg, this is something I can't figure out. You got to take it to the dealer." I always hate to take it to the dealer because I feel like they're going to tell me 65 things that need to be fixed that probably don't. Well, sure enough, they told me here's what's got to be fixed, but then they gave me a bill for $5,200 to get the other stuff fixed. But here's what they said: and if you don't get those things fixed, you won't be able to get that license plate. You won't be able to pass emissions and safety, and therefore your car is kind of dead in the water. Wow. There I was, and I couldn't resolve this at all. What do? Well, if you would give that decision over to a third party and have them make it for you, you tell me, would they go through all the research that I went through? Would they go through all the potential? I started thinking of, well, do I have to turn it in, maybe get another car? Well, that's going to be money I don't have either, so do I want to do that? I don't want to do this in the middle of this crisis. Maybe we're moving to D.C. What do I do? Who's going to take all those things into account and then make the best financial as well as social decision for me? Well, here's how this all worked out. If I would have just given that over to that third party at the dealer, I'd be $5,200 out of pocket, and I'm still not sure they would completely fix that car the way I wanted to. But at least I'd have my plates. I took it back, went through all these other scenarios, and finally took it to my other mechanic and said, see if it'll pass emissions and safety. They did it. $26. It passed. I've got plates. I'm going to take care of this thing, but now I've got 2 years to figure this out. So what I'm saying is, when we give away our right to make decisions about the important things in our life, I know a car is not that important, but when we talk about your health care, your education, you talk about, are we free to move out into the world again because of this pandemic? Who has the right and responsibility to make those decisions? That's the key. Healthcare, who decides? Education, who decides? Even going to church, who decides? No, we do. I think the hard part about when I read some of these things that are out there, the challenges, the issues that are out there, we don't really have a hierarchical top-down solution making for all these issues. We're thankful for our government giving us information, although even there we've got to be critical in how we receive that information and think through that information. I think our constitutional republic avoids what I call the dangers of absolute democracies, where sinful people, once they have a majority, they can do whatever they please, or what I call sinful tyrannical monarchies. It's this constitutional republic that allows decisions to be made as close to home as possible. And we're starting to see, again, one size does not fit all. Some states are doing a better job than other states. I find it amazing. I'm not going to pick on this, but if your parents were in a nursing home and the state said, well, these older folks that are in these nursing homes, we've taken them to the hospital, but they've got COVID-19, and we're going to demand that they get sent back to the nursing home. I'm sorry, but no. And then I have to, can I take my parents out of that situation? One person was making that decision. Now they've rescinded that decision. Now they're saying, no, keep them in the hospital till they get well, or keep them quarantined till they get well. But one person decided, no, send them back. And that's the most vulnerable population was those in nursing homes. And the state made decisions to send COVID-19 people back into the midst of them. So again, who decides? One size fits all does not bode well for us. And in Florida, they protected the most vulnerable from these kind of things, and it's working out much better. So we follow guidelines that are reasonable, limited, that inform our decisions. And if the church is silenced now, folks, and this is going to be the hard thing going forward, if the church is silenced at this point, then everybody's liberties are at risk. And for those of you who don't believe in God, I know that you're thinking, how's that possible? Then you need to read up on the uniqueness of the American experiment and how it literally came to fruition in constitutional protections and things. Because a faith relationship with God and a faith understanding that there's a higher authority that we have to answer to is fundamental to the reality of your individual liberty and fundamental to being able to tell the government when they're overstepping their boundaries. The second part of what I want to talk about today is church and family. And church and family is one of the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty's main concerns, as I said before. We talk about the institution of family, not the relationship of family. I don't want to get into this today, but the idea that family is being reduced to just your relationship, that's one of the problems, and that's kind of the 60s redefining our institutions. No, the family is an institution. The society is inherent in father, mother, child, and no other relationship has that capacity inherent in its relationship, and that just makes it different. It doesn't. I'm not going to debate these other relationships, but they're not the institution of family. And what we begin to realize is that when we start talking about these pandemics and COVID-19, policy doesn't solve everything. You can come up with the best policy for COVID-19 and there's still going to be issues that policy cannot deal with. So the real fears today are about our mortality, the fragility of human life. I think the stupidity of libertinism, which flows from an eat, drink, and be merry today for tomorrow you die mentality. And it creates this I get to do as I please mentality. All that stuff is what we're battling against. And the best solution to that is not a policy. The best solution to that, I believe, is to be taught, modeled, supported, and undergirded by the family and the church. And so that's the key to this. What is church and family? What has it got to do with this reopening stuff? And I said, use your sanctified common sense. You know the commandment, honor your father and your mother, and it's a fundamental thing written into nature itself by God himself. Every culture has a sense of this. Even cultures that are not Christian have a sense that the family is vital. The Christian culture just orders authority properly, it supposedly. Family on top, and all these other authorities flow from the family. They are not above the family. If there's any policy, like I've said before, that puts government and school over the family, that's a bad policy. And it's not going to be good in the long run. But again, the point is that family, we kind of understand this. Family first, neighborhood next, federal government only when necessary. And so the best exercise of liberty is when it is close to home, when it emanates from the bottom up, when it emanates from the family outward. And so this, this idea that we follow the science, right? We follow the science when it fits our worldview. We follow the science, don't follow it when it doesn't. And Christians may be subject to that too, but I can tell you the supposed scientism type folks, public policy folks, whenever they say, we just follow the science, oh please, look at their presuppositions to what they're talking about. Because the science says that poverty, criminality, racism, education, the best thing that solves these problems are healthy families in healthy communities. And when you start to get into these issues that are being debated today, jump to their solutions to see where their presuppositions are coming from. I can guarantee you if their solution is give all this authority over to a third-party bureaucrat, or no, empower family, empower neighborhood, empower business, those are the way that the solutions go. And as soon as you get to their solutions, then you can understand their presuppositions and you can critically think about what they're talking about. So family, church, neighborhood, community, any policy that undermines that is destined to fail. So use your sanctified common sense. just think about this in your own life. When you think about what are my responsibilities, how can I make a difference in life? If you're a good father, you're a good mother, you take care of your kids. Your kids are part of the family, and they try to honor the family. When you put all those things together, good things happen out of that. And I'm not talking about that families have to be perfect, but when they're focused on those are the things that matter. My job is about how I can support my family. All the things that I do, they're all supposed to actually be interwoven into my family, because that's that first line of being a good citizen, if you will. Now, if you dismiss your responsibilities there, chaos. And the chaos is not only in your family structure, the chaos begins to emanate out into the community and into the culture in which we live. And we see that today. In fact, the article that I wanted to pull out there's an article that was written here, and it came from Breakpoint. It says, "Marriage hits a new low." This is a bad trend in America, that people just aren't getting married, and they don't want to get married. And if they do come together, they don't stay together, because marriage is really that willingness to say, I will, contractually as well as emotionally and spiritually say, I will honor this relationship above all for the rest of my life. And we're teaching our young people it doesn't matter as long as you're happy. And so marriage is hitting a new low, and that is destructive. Now, Western Europe is already dying because of their dismissal of marriage. They're dying as a culture. We're not there yet, but if we teach that marriage is not essential, children are just kind of an afterthought, and if we do have children, we give them over to some educational bureaucracy that starts from cradle to grave, this is going to not bode well for our culture as a whole. So that's something I read this week, and I said, wow, the church, this is some place where we can respond. Now, we may not have an immediate solution to what's going on right now, but we can start to say, wait a minute, we're going to be a church that now dedicates itself even more to undergirding family. Maybe we even have classes for the neighborhood about family. And so we invite even people who don't necessarily go to our church, come to this, because if you can undergird your family, if you can begin to see what it means to be a healthy father, mother, child, and family together, and see how important that is, not just to your own personal well-being, but to even our cultural well-being. You can be of service to your neighborhood, and a lot of things can be solved when we take that responsibility. Having inherent First Amendment rights. Well, right to what? Right to also be this kind of voice in our culture. So family and church, I think they're the solution to a lot of these issues, because people right now are dealing with their mortality. They're dealing with the fragility of life. And I'm telling you, if you're waiting for the government to send you a check, if that's your solution, I got bad news for you. Eventually, that destroys the engine that produces those checks, and eventually they stop sending you the check, and they keep the check themselves. I'll give you an example. I don't know how many of you are waiting till July 15th to pay your taxes. I am, but July 15th is going to be a brutal day. April 15th is bad enough, but now everything I owe, because I also pay quarterly taxes, everything I owe from April 15th to July 15th is now due on July 15th. I'm telling you, I haven't written checks for that amount forever. Now, it's going to be fine. I've got the money set aside, but it's funny. They never seem to think, why don't we reduce our government grab of you in this pandemic? You've lost your job, you've lost your income, but we may delay it, but we're still going to ask for you to give everything that you owe us. And the government's going to get all that they supposedly want and need and more. Well, whatever happened to prosper with each other or suffer with each other? And so again, you start to see what happens when you start to give all this away to somebody. When they start making decisions, they're going to make decisions that are ultimately best for themselves. That's what sinful, selfish people do. Our founding fathers knew we were sinful, selfish people, and so they limited the authority of the government so that you could be free. And that's a beautiful thing. Now, who could be against this? And I've written a mom and pop paper for you. You can read this more later. It's amidst COVID-19, marriage and family matter now more than ever. And I talk about how marriage is not only God's blessing, but it's also God's capacity for society. And I talk about that, and then talk about why families are needed now more than ever, and how we can be a part of that solution as the church. The reason I wrote this is because there's a scholar from the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, and she said the coronavirus crisis shows it's time to abolish the family. And again, you have to say, well, then what's your solution? And the solution is whatever the family provides for you, now government and social services is going to provide for you. I read another article, this amazing thing, that I think it was a pastor who was trying to open up the church, and they sent social services to his house. Now, if you've never been, I've served people who had their children turn them into social services. They thought it was a joke, but they didn't realize once daddy and mom get turned over to social services, they are now, the state can come in and swoop in and take them over. And they just thought it was funny. They thought, they saw some ad that said, if you ever have a problem with your mom and dad, call us. And they did. Well, what is social services being sent to deal with pastors who are talking about this COVID crisis? Do you see how government can kind of work nefariously? Send that person in, because we know if they go, it'll stick. That's scary stuff. That's scary stuff. So again, who could be against this? Well, when you read this person's article, she talks about how the family is actually what's gotten us into all this trouble. And I just keep thinking, what is she talking about? Right now, as I've said before, my family is my rock, and my extended family, as I think about how we could all come together if we had to, that is our capacity. And if we keep working on that, that allows us to actually do things that no one else can do for us. So again, church, this is one of those times when we can actually, I think we can be part of the solution going forward. This is not going to be some policy right now, but going forward, we can be part of the solution that says, hey, have you ever understood, take a relook at the institution of family with us, relook at the power of faith in your life, because this really matters. I am reading some articles where people are saying, hey, turning back to the church, turning back to faith is important. That's because mortality is the issue. People are afraid of what could happen today. Well, Christians, we know that that could happen any day. But there's a Lord who actually lived and died and rose again and said, I will have the last say in your life, and you will live forever with me. So our temporal liberty to proclaim that eternal message is what we fight for. So put your temporal liberties to work. Push back on the diminution of those liberties. Yes, so when the government overreaches, we've got to push it back, because we have a constitutional right and responsibility to do that. But then we have a constitutional responsibility to exercise our worldview for the sake of others. And that's where I think we need to put that to work, and we can do that especially with our teaching on family. So that's the charge. You're freed to serve. It's a conscience level compulsion. It's never a state coerced reality, at least not in America. And crisis is the worst time to give away your individual liberties to somebody else. That's the time to look to family, to look to church, to look to community, not to some overseeing bureaucrat who can never finally do what's best for you, and oftentimes doesn't even live under the guidelines they propose for us. So keep moving forward and begin to realize that every week we're going to have to learn how to do this and to engage these things with knowledge, with courage, and with faith. And I think that's what a two-kingdom way of engaging these things is all about. So LCRL is here to help you do that. Our last thing today, I started off with a question and a letter from Ed, and I want to end with Cheryl asked this, and it was a great question. She was watching a show, and as I said, put your critical thinking caps on, if you will. And what I mean by critical thinking is, I mean, listen and kind of assess the information that you're getting. And she said it was a Fox News article about Pastor Brian Gibson, a Kentucky pastor, who said this. He said, every day the church is closed, a bit of our liberty dies. How true is it that we are endowed by our Creator to be free to be faithful, which is also guaranteed in our Constitution? And so that idea that she said, talk about that. Absolutely. This idea of religious liberty protects the liberties of everyone. And that's something where, if you don't know how that works constitutionally, you need to read up on that, because the idea of religious liberty was that the Founding Fathers believed that our faithfulness to God, and religion is faithfulness to something bigger than yourself, and you don't determine what's bigger than yourself. God is bigger than you are, and that becomes that curb, and we freely seek to honor those things. The Founding Fathers believed that was the key to a civil society, and that was the key to everyone's liberty, even those who weren't necessarily religious. And I think they're absolutely right. The movements, the political movements of the last century, the 20th century, the secular movements, you see these secular governments coming in, and when the secular governments take over and become the higher authority, you as an individual cease to exist. So I think she's very right on that, so I thank her for that. Then she did challenge this, though. She said, but he had an additional comment. He said, the pastor said, there's a time to be quiet and a time to be a lamb, but today's the time to be a lion. Well, what should we do? And she said, I thought, doesn't God say, be still and know that I am God, and be still, the Lord will fight for you? And she was quoting something from Exodus. That Exodus thing is particular to the people of that moment, but there are verses in the Psalms where God says, in these big issues of life, there's some things only I can fight for. Well, that's what Jesus did on the cross. You can't fight for the things that Jesus fought for on the cross for you. But the temporal liberties you have, God actually tells us to exercise His moral wisdom there. I don't know if I would use the word lion, the metaphor of lion, but I would say there are times to stand and there are times to serve. And even when you stand, you're standing there with a mindset of a servant. So if you go back to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the Old Testament, and you see them being thrown into the fiery furnace, they're saying, we're standing here. We're not going to kneel to your proclamation, O king, but we're standing here for you. Even if we lose our lives, we're doing this for your sake. So even if we stand with the courage of a lion, it's not the devouring metaphor. God is the one who judges. God is the one who saves. But when it comes to exercising our liberties for the sake of sharing the gospel, I would say use that word stand and serve, or be wise as serpents, harmless as doves. And both of those things are things we need to be doing all the time. So again, thank you so much. Your temporal freedom issues are vital today. As long as you understand we're not just in a protection mode, we're trying to figure out how to be Christ's people in the middle of all this stuff. And today we're going to push back and say, look, if they're not going to give us our constitutional First Amendment rights to deal with this information and go forward, we'll push back on that. We've already seen some great things where Nathan, fought for the sake of the churches in Idaho, and it worked wonderfully. People are petitioning for their rights in certain states, and they're being honored. Bill Barr is actually doing some good things, and he's telling some of these governors, you can't be doing this stuff. There's constitutional limitations to what you can do. And so good things are happening. I think if you just exercise those freedoms responsibly, with humility, and also with wisdom, you'll do exactly what God needs you to do for the sake of your communities and your family. So thanks again for being with us. Please, if you join us, Word from the Center, text LCRL to 444-999. And even in our invitation today, there's a button where if you want to support the work that we're doing in D.C., we've signed on to a couple of these letters to the governors and to the senators and things like that, and I think these things are working. But if you want to support our work, we sure could use that right now, just like everybody can. And there's a link that you can do that on our webpage as well. God bless you. God be with you. Put your temporal liberties to work for the sake of the eternal liberties of Christ. And stand firm in His name, and we will be useful in His hands. Have a great day. See you next week.